Welcome, bienvenue. Je m'appelle Karine Morin, je suis présidente et chef de la direction de la Fédération des sciences humaines. Today's event is truly a bilingual one in English and French. Simultaneous interpretation is available in English, French, American Sign Language, and Quebec Sign Language. Closed captioning is also provided in both English and French. Nous offrons aujourd'hui des services d'interprétation simultanée de sous-titrage en anglais et français, ainsi que l'interprétation langue des signes québécoise. So to access sign language interpretation, in-person attendees can refer to the screens to the side of the stage. Virtual attendees can enable on-screen sign language interpretation by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of their screen. To access French and English interpretation or captions, those in the room need to scan the QR codes on the screen above me. The interpretation QR will take you to the Zoom webinar, and once you're there, you'll do as those already in the virtual space. You'll click on the globe icon to select your preferred language and listen using your own earpieces. I would like to make a land acknowledgement. If you are joining us virtually, we recognize that the following land acknowledgement may not be for the territory that you're currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders of it. Ici, nous sommes au Collège George Brown. Nous sommes réunis sur le territoire traditionnel de la Première Nation des Mississaugas de Credit et d'autres peuples autochtones qui ont vécu ici au fil du temps. Nous sommes reconnaissants de pouvoir partager cette terre en tant que signataires de traités qui apprennent, travaillent et vivent ensemble au sein de cette communauté. And so as we explore new pedagogies of togetherness, we're called to honor Indigenous traditions of learning rooted in community, land, and relationship. This requires us to examine the colonial legacies embedded in our institutions and imagining learning environments that are accessible, collaborative, and grounded in justice for all. As to this series, au nom de la Fédération des sciences humaines et du Collège George Brown, j'ai le plaisir de vous accueillir à la 4e et dernière causerie Voir Grand du 94e Congrès des sciences humaines, les pédagogies du vivre-ensemble au travers des pratiques d'apprentissage inclusif. Pedagogies of Togetherness, Practices for Inclusive Learning. This Big Thinking lecture series at Congress brings together scholars to address some of the most pressing issues of our time, and today's panel will explore inclusive teaching practices, research-informed approaches to accessibly new models of learning that challenge traditional hierarchies and invite collaborative systems change across the post-secondary landscape. We're joined by 3 outstanding educational leaders, Paul Turcotte, Jessica Riddell, and Normand Labrie. I thank them for joining us today. For this session, and as Congress continues, you can participate in the conversation on social media using the hashtag Congress, that is Congress with an H at the end. Also, on behalf of the Federation and George Brown College, I would like to thank the Big Thinking lecture series sponsors, that is Universities Canada, as well as this session sponsor, the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. Merci à la Fondation canadienne pour l'innovation de commanditer cette causerie. We will therefore begin with a recorded opening remarks from Sylvain Charbonneau, President, CEO of the CFI, and following that, we'll invite our speakers and moderator to join us on stage. On to the video.
Bonjour, c'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui et de représenter la Fondation canadienne pour l'innovation. We proudly support research infrastructure for projects across Canada in the social sciences and humanities to help address some of the most pressing questions of our time. Thank you for allowing me the honor of introducing this fascinating panel discussion called Pedagogies of Togetherness, Practices for Inclusive Learning, les pédagogies du vivre-ensemble au travers des pratiques d'apprentissage inclusif. Our panelists will be exploring the important questions of how we can foster post-secondary environments that embrace collaborative and accessible approaches to teaching and learning while encouraging more just and responsive educational systems. Nous avons 2 panélistes aujourd'hui. Paul Turcotte est professeur au département de philosophie du Cégep du Vieux-Montréal et chercheur associé au Centre de recherche pour l'inclusion des personnes en situation de handicap. His work focuses on fostering inclusive pedagogical practices. He has recently turned to outdoor teaching in an interdisciplinary context with the objectives of making the reflective rigor of higher education accessible to the widest possible audience. He has advised higher education institutions in Quebec and in France on their transition towards more inclusive learning environments. Jessica Riddle is a full professor of early modern literature at Bishop's University and founder of the Hope Circuits Institute, where she drives systems change in higher education, focusing on governance, leadership, and student success. Our 2024 book, Hope Circuits, Rewiring Universities and Other Organizations for Human Flourishing, offers a roadmap for a transformation of our post-secondary ecosystem to be more centered on justice, equity, and access. And our moderator today is Normand Labrie, who is President and Vice Chancellor of the l'Université de l'Ontario français and Vice President and Chair of the Council of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Il est expert en bilinguisme et en politique linguistique. Il a été professeur à l'Université de Toronto pendant plus de 3 décennies. Et il a dirigé le Centre de recherche en éducation franco-ontarienne. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Welcome, Drs. Turcotte, Riddle and Labrie. Commençons cette discussion qui promet d'être fort intéressante.
Bonjour. Bonjour tout le monde. Let me start with introducing, and then we'll have questions and discussions around the pedagogies of togetherness. Let me start in French first. De grands bouleversements ont affecté nos sociétés à l'échelle globale au cours des 5 dernières années. À commencer par la pandémie causée par le COVID-19, l'assassinat de George Floyd aux États-Unis au même moment, qui a inspiré le mouvement Black Lives Matter, qui a vraiment mis en évidence toute la question des discriminations raciales. La montée de l'extrême droite dans plusieurs pays dans le monde, le génocide palestinien mené par l'État d'Israël en réaction aux attentats terroristes qui ont eu lieu en Israël, et le chamboulement des règles économiques et de l'ordre mondial par un président américain pour le moins erratique, qui s'en prend entre autres aux institutions postsecondaires, à la liberté académique, au financement de la recherche et aux étudiants internationaux. Such upheavals necessarily have impacts on individuals, on society, and on post-secondary education and institutions. The pandemic has placed individuals in isolation, but at the same time, this isolation was intended as an unprecedented gesture of solidarity with the most vulnerable members of society. The upheaval of the world order by an American president brought to power by capitalizing on ideological polarization, on relying on misinformation, ignorance, and a spirit of revenge has resulted in a real need and desire for national unity here in Canada. These are contradictions, paradoxes somehow in both cases. We are collectively learning to live more and more than ever with uncertainty, ambiguity, paradoxes. So, Jessica and Paul, what does this mean for pedagogy? Both in terms of content, what we teach and learn, but also in terms of teaching strategies and practices. Is it still possible to envision and implement a pedagogy of living together in that context? I'll just stop here, and I have more questions, but let's start with that. What does it mean for pedagogy?
Thank you, Normand, and thank you so much for joining us and gathering today. I think it means more now than ever for us to get together, to sit in difference, to sit in spaces where we can disagree without delegitimizing each other, where we can engage in what I've started to call vigorous civility. So being able to put something in the middle of the table and to say, I'm not too sure I am right, and then together can we figure it out through the grace and love and empathy and rigor of the work that we do. And, you know, I think that there is increasingly for me, the education sector itself is the only place who has a mandate of hope. And by hope, I mean challenging the actual in the name of the possible. That's a definition from Ira Shore, who wrote a book called Empowering Students. And how we challenge the actual in the name of the possible right now feels not just timely but urgent, as the list of heartbreaking horrors that Normand listed for us continues to show up in our news feeds, in our doom scrolling, is lighting up all of our dopamine little lizard brains as we panic at the disco. So what does it mean to come back to our fundamentals? What does it mean to re-pledge ourselves to education as a sector whose mandate is hope? Industry, government, not incentivized to do the kind of work that we need to do to gather, to rumble, to reflect, and to ask some really difficult questions of our time. And I fundamentally believe that the pedagogy that we know and that we use in our classrooms is the way forward, that a beautifully designed classroom gives us a roadmap for how we do a civil and just society. And you know, this word justice, that I love the definition of Cornel West, who says, justice is love done in public. And if that is part of our mandate in education, then isn't it also hope being done in public, in content, in form, in the way we design our classrooms, in how we govern, how we lead, how we mentor. So the beautifully designed classroom, which Paul is going to talk about in beautiful detail, those values that animate our work, collaboration, consent, compassion, community, curiosity, all of those things we already do in our pedagogy. How do we do that at different tables? How do we do that as citizens of this rapidly disrupting, accelerated moment of uncertainty at this time where we need to double down on education?
Paul.
Il y avait hier, merci tout le monde d'être ici. Hier soir, il y avait, j'ai oublié son nom, je suis désolé, mais la représentante de l'association étudiante du George Brown College, où on est présentement, qui nous challengeait, qui nous remettait en question de revoir notre façon de considérer que nos étudiants, les gens qui sont au cégep, à l'université, sont le futur. Elle nous disait, on n'est pas le futur, on est le présent. Ça, je pense que c'est quelque chose qui est très important parce que de toutes les belles valeurs que tu as dit, la confiance, l'ouverture, etc., je pense que c'est la question de la confiance qui doit être au centre de notre relation avec notre propre profession et aussi avec nos étudiants. Parce qu'il faut se faire confiance, faire en sorte que dans ce monde qui est, on l'a bien dit, plein de défis, plein de remises en question, plein de choses assez inquiétantes, faut se l'avouer, il faut faire confiance. Il faut se faire confiance qu'on est capable, en tant que professeur, d'individu, en tant qu'institution, en tant que département, en tant que collègue, en tant que fédération, si ça se trouve, d'être à la hauteur de ces défis-là, puis non seulement d'être nous à la hauteur, mais de considérer les personnes à qui on enseigne, les gens qui sont les acteurs centraux. Pourquoi il y a des écoles dans la vie? Parce qu'il y a des étudiants. On n'est pas là pour s'autosuffire. Si on fait de la recherche, si on fait avancer les connaissances, c'est dans le but de pouvoir transmettre toujours au suivant. Et donc, il faut avoir la confiance d'écouter ces gens-là, écouter ces personnes-là, ces jeunes, qui sont, oui, bien sûr, le futur, Plus on est jeune, plus on est le futur, mais ils sont aussi le présent. Et la relation peut être réciproque, doit être réciproque en fait, pour faire en sorte qu'on puisse justement relever ces défis-là et établir un climat qui va être de la véritable construction, parce que sinon on est davantage dans la transmission puis dans l'imposition d'une certaine façon. Alors il faut qu'au contraire, on soit capable d'entrer dans un dialogue, j'ai l'impression, avec ces personnes, ces jeunes, qui vont être capables de nous en apprendre au moins autant qu'on est capable, peut-être pas au moins autant, mais en tout cas, être capable de nous en apprendre beaucoup.
Merci à vous deux. I would continue with asking you, what is your assessment of how post-secondary institutions are currently navigating these challenges as institutions? Colleges, polytechnics, universities, etc.
Thank you. This is the last time I'm going to speak on my Canadian sort of speaking tour, which has been about 14 months in the making since the book I wrote on March the 12th came out. And so I've been talking to colleges and universities and institutes over the last 14 months and asking them how they're doing, and sitting with some concepts placed in the middle of the table, pulling them apart and putting them back together. I think in total over the last 14 months, I've engaged with 63 universities and colleges and 42 organizations or associations. And each one of those institutions is different, distinct, unique. It has its own ecosystem of governance, about how value circulates, about the convergences between people, structures, and the institutional culture. So I never want to talk about our sector in monolith, in terms of monolith. I want us to get local and granular and proximate. But I can make some general observations, which is our universities and colleges are experiencing a paradigm shift, and a big one at that. We have inherited often colonial structures that we've been tweaking and sort of working on and thinking about for about 80 years, probably since the beginning of the sort of phase that we're in right now, starting at the end of the Second World War. And we've tweaked and tweaked and tweaked, and we've run out of room. And we start to see, if anybody is in the room who's a scientific philosopher, the notion of scientific revolution from Thomas Kuhn, where he says that anomalies start to collect and accumulate over time within any dominant paradigm. And the dominant paradigm usually has tools to assimilate those anomalies back into the centers of power until those anomalies start to accumulate to a point where it tips a paradigm over the edge. And what happens is, in Thomas Kuhn's notion of scientific revolution, that what happens at that moment, at that tipping point, is that folks in the centers of power double down on the tools of the dominant paradigm, which only precipitates the crisis. It only accelerates the change, and it launches us into this stage that Kuhn calls extraordinary research. It's the in-between space between two paradigms before a new paradigm has emerged. And in this space, in this sort of threshold, we get to go back to basics. We get to go back to vocabulary. We get to go back to fundamental principles and ask, who are we? Why are we here? Are we fulfilling our public purpose? Are we, in fact, clear, all of us across our campus communities, clear on our social contract? And so this is an opportunity, I think, in 14 months ago when the book came out, I would use language of paradigm shifts. I now am using, I think, more urgent language, that we are in a moment where our sector is collapsing. And many of our universities and colleges and polytechnics are experiencing the anomalies accumulating and tipping them over, whether that is the international studies student policy changes, provincial funding changes, the demographic cliff that we're about to fall over by the end of this decade, changes in the ways in which our 21st century learners learn and engage with the world. And so, I think that we are, as a sector, at this moment of invitation, where we can go back to fundamentals, we can build shared vocabulary, we can remember our fundamental principles, we can all get shared purpose and then move in a direction together. And I'm really cognizant of, sort of not erasing difference, because I think that there are pockets of flourishing. I think there are a number of universities and colleges who are living into integrity, who recognize that there's a difference between what we say and what we do, right? Our mission, vision, and values, and then how we operationalize them. And I think there's an earnest wish to mind the gap, that integrity gap, and to take real steps to close that gap. So there are beautiful examples, both local, proximate, and granular, but also at the institutional and even provincial levels, where we are imagining that something different is possible. We are challenging the actual in the name of the possible. But we are at this moment of invitation. We are at a moment where we need to rumble on who we are and what our public purpose is. And I think that that's exciting. There's a lot of pundits and consultants and politicians who are peddling in some disdain and data right now, right? They're projecting dystopian futures. They're giving us damning indictments of what is wrong with higher education. This is why you can't have nice things, they tell us. No one's coming to save you, they warn us. And yet I think something else is different. I don't think a dystopian future is inevitable. I think a creative future is within reach. And I think our students who teach us how to learn, who sit in the messiness, who metabolize the uncertainty in real time, are some of our greatest guides as we figure this out together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to just ask you something. You said something very strong, like our institutions collapsing. That's very serious. Our institutions operate on a very slow pace. Change in post-secondary education is very, very slow. So do we have the capacity on that pace to make exactly the transformation that you're foreseeing that we need to do, and that where we're heading maybe?
And I will defend the glacial pace of our change in our higher education systems, because I do think that we have governance, but bicameral governance or tricameral governance or unicameral governance that is built in so that we're not chasing shiny objects, that we are not responding with knee-jerk reactions to the whims of government or to a particular funding envelope, that we are committed to a purpose and to a timeline that's really important, that is legacy building and generative. And there's a yes and, right? That we need to look around and recognize that this is not normal, that we are in unprecedented times. I don't use unprecedented very often. I'm a Shakespearean scholar. So Shakespeare was writing at a time of tariffs, of trade wars, of threats of invasion and annexation, of a global pandemic, of the end of a collapse of an old world view, the great chain of being, the emergence of humanism. He was writing at a time where Catholicism was collapsing and Reformation was emerging. He was writing at a time where old world views were no longer able to account for the experience, and new worldviews were emerging. So I don't use unprecedented lightly. And I think we're in unprecedented times, and we need to figure out how to move together in a direction of shared purpose relatively quickly. And I use the quotation from Loretta Ross, who's a social activist, and she says there's a difference between a cult and a movement. She says a cult is a bunch of people moving in the same direction, thinking the same thing. And a movement is a bunch of people moving in the same direction, thinking different things. And when I read that, I thought, that's the superpower of post-secondary. That's where we need to go. Preserve difference. Equity is excellence. We bring all of our different disciplinary lenses and lived experiences to this work. We have to dismantle and recenter traditional forms of authority and expertise, be humble and brave enough to put in the middle of the table, I'm not too sure I am right, and be willing to listen with an intention to transform. And I think that's what our students give us all of the time. And we need to take that into our institutions, at our governance levels, boards, senates, faculty associations, all of us need to sit with our shared purpose and figure this out. And I think we've got 2 to 5 years. I think the portal is short for what the new paradigm is going to look like. And if we are not architects of what that looks like, there will be other people who already have a plan of what a new paradigm looks like. And it's privatization, it's fiscal, it's credentialized, it's transactional, and it is not built on the deep civic engagement that our education systems are mandated to serve.
Thank you. Thank you.
Et pour faire ça, on a quelque chose on dispose d'un outil, j'ai l'impression, aux études postsecondaires, qui s'appelle la classe. Hein? On est dans un système où, pour une période de 15 semaines, on nous donne, on nous offre, on nous met en contact avec une vingtaine, une trentaine, une quinzaine, ça dépend du milieu, de jeunes personnes qui demandent rien que ça, d'essayer d'inventer ce nouveau monde-là. Bien, il faut leur donner la chance de le faire. C'est-à-dire qu'il faut il faut oser, il faut prendre l'initiative, il faut essayer des nouvelles façons de faire, il faut les placer dans un environnement que la classe permet de faire. La classe, c'est un formidable laboratoire où on peut mettre des idées sur la table. Ils ne feront pas ça nécessairement, les gens. Les personnes ne font pas ça dans la vie, à part à l'école, à part dans la classe. Les personnes, les étudiants, les étudiantes, le monde dans lequel on vit, ce n'est pas quelque chose qui est valorisé, ce n'est pas quelque chose qui est mis de l'avant. C'est quelque chose que seule l'école permet de faire. Puis c'est le moment des études postsecondaires où il y a ce niveau, j'ai l'impression, de maturité dans la discussion, ce niveau aussi d'appétit pour apprendre puis pour créer, parce que à 19, 18, 20, 25 ans, c'est là qu'on a l'énergie, puis que notre espoir n'a peut-être pas été entamé encore. Il faut travailler avec ça, il faut se nourrir de ça pour proposer ce laboratoire de ce nouveau monde, ce changement de paradigme, comme vous dites bien, qui peut se faire dans la classe. Donc, il faut oser des nouvelles façons d'enseigner, il faut oser des nouvelles façons de parler les uns avec les autres, il faut oser des nouvelles façons aussi de se mobiliser puis de prendre position. C'est l'âge où, à 19, 20 ans, on a tout à gagner puis pas grand-chose à perdre. Donc, pourquoi ne pas profiter, ce n'est pas nécessairement un bon mot, mais pourquoi ne pas saisir cette chance-là, en fait, cette opportunité qui nous est présentée et qui est là. Donc, je pense que la classe, le groupe, c'est ce lieu où la confiance peut se bâtir, c'est ce lieu où la rigueur peut toujours être là, mais ne doit pas être confondue avec la rigidité, n'est-ce pas? On peut être rigoureux sans être rigide. Puis ça, bien, ça prend de l'audace, ça prend des nouvelles façons d'enseigner. Puis je pense que le moment est excessivement important et critique. Et il faut se donner l'opportunité, le courage, comme enseignant, comme professeur, de catalyser ce changement-là, j'ai l'impression.
Merci, Paul. Justement, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire dans la salle de classe, peu importe la matière à l'étude ou pour enseigner à apprendre de vivre ensemble, parce qu'on sur le thème, on est dans un contexte très changeant, mais aussi on a justement besoin d'apprendre à vivre ensemble, alors qu'il y a beaucoup de raisons de division. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut donc faire en salle de classe pour enseigner et apprendre le vivre ensemble, la justice sociale, l'inclusion?
Bien, j'ai l'impression qu'il y a plusieurs choses qu'on peut faire. Profiter de ce lieu unique qui est la classe, premièrement. Pour faire quoi? Je l'ai déjà dit un petit peu, mais je pense que une des clés qui est à la fois quelque chose d'important en classe, mais qui va être une capacité aussi à développer chez nos étudiants pour être capable de naviguer dans les temps troubles dans lesquels on vit, c'est la flexibilité. La flexibilité, ce n'est pas nécessairement une des caractéristiques principales des institutions postsecondaires. Il y a des façons de faire, il y a des traditions, il y a des impératifs méthodologiques, bref, il y a toutes sortes de composantes qui vont contre une valorisation de la flexibilité. Il faut qu'on remette en question, pour revenir, comme vous le disiez, aux fondamentaux. Mais pourquoi on est là? Pourquoi on est là? Est-ce qu'on est là pour renforcer un monde qui s'en va nulle part? Pas nécessairement. Est-ce qu'on est là pour inventer des nouvelles façons de faire? Je pense que oui. La pandémie, on l'a mentionné d'entrée de jeu, a beaucoup affaibli les capacités, justement, relationnelles. On vit dans un monde aussi où les réseaux sociaux, les écrans, tout ça, ont des formidables possibilités. C'est pas quelque chose que je veux démoniser nécessairement, mais ce n'est pas nécessairement non plus quelque chose qui amène à aller vers son prochain et vers les autres. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour favoriser le vivre ensemble? Bien, vivre ensemble. Utiliser cette classe-là, les asseoir les élèves ensemble, leur permettre de divaguer. Je veux dire une chose qui est vraiment qui est banale. Là. Ça peut avoir l'air trivial, mais dans mes classes, je fais toujours des cercles de lecture. J'aime beaucoup la littérature aussi. On fait lire des textes et je leur demande d'en parler. Depuis 2, 3 sessions, je dirais, puis c'est quelque chose que j'ai observé autour de moi, j'en ai parlé avec des collègues aussi, il faut leur laisser le temps de parler d'autres choses. On les assoit ensemble, ils doivent parler d'un texte de Shakespeare, ils doivent parler d'un texte de Nietzsche, ils doivent parler de quelque chose. Ils en parlent. Ce n'est pas parce qu'ils ne sont pas en train de parler de ça précisément qu'ils se racontent des histoires, qu'ils sont en train de se challenger les uns les autres sur, par exemple, le masculinisme. On diverge vers ça. On n'arrête pas ces discussions-là. On les encourage. On les laisse aller. Donc, il faut, pour mieux vivre ensemble, il faut mettre les élèves ensemble, leur permettre de s'exprimer, leur permettre de se confronter, être nous-mêmes des exemples d'ouverture, de dire tous les sujets sont possibles. Parce que si on commence à empêcher les discussions, bien, les discussions vont cesser, puis c'est pas comme ça que ça va avancer.
Merci. We were talking just before the session about the difference that you make between safe space and brave space. I think is that what you're referring to here?
Oui, c'est ça. C'est une distinction sur laquelle je suis tombé là, dans les recherches récemment. On connaît tous les safe spaces. C'est un endroit où les gens peuvent se sentir en sécurité. Puis c'est super important parce que pour pouvoir prendre la parole, il faut avoir un minimum de sécurité, évidemment. Mais le corollaire à ça, puis peut-être l'étape subséquente, c'est ce que j'ai vu qui s'appelait un brave space, c'est-à-dire que cette sécurité-là n'est pas une fin en soi. Cette sécurité-là, c'est la condition pour pouvoir, je reviens souvent à ce concept-là, mais pouvoir avoir la confiance de s'exprimer et aussi d'être confronté dans ses propres idées. C'est-à-dire que c'est dans un processus comme ça d'échange, de dialectique, respectueux, constructif, qui vise à avancer, qu'on va pouvoir justement avoir des nouvelles idées. Parce que si on est dans un strict processus de protection, la protection et le retrait sur ses propres positions me semble parfois, dans mes observations, aller de soi. Donc, il faut avoir le courage, la capacité de profiter de la sécurité qu'offre la classe, qu'offre le contexte scolaire, que le contexte scolaire doit garantir aussi pour avancer et confronter les idées.
Thank you. So we talked a bit about your research, Jessica. We talked about teaching and learning. Another role of post-secondary institutions is also community service, serving the community. And we're supposed to contribute somehow to the development of society and communities. So Jessica, how can classroom learning be transferred to the microcosms of society?
Thank you. So I mentioned I'm a Shakespearean, and I introduce myself as a Shakespearean both by training and disposition. So I see the world through my disciplinary lens. And by that I mean that the theater and the classroom and a civil and just society for me are very similar ecosystems. And they're designed based on the same invitations and principles. So if you think about going to a Shakespeare play, and I highly recommend you go check out the Stratford Festival this year. They have some remarkable performances, only an hour and a half south of here. But what Shakespeare's plays offer us is an invitation to imagine different kinds of universes. So when you show up as a spectator, you show up in this, if you were to go to the Globe Theatre in London, it's a bare wooden O. It's a bare stage. There are no lighting effects. There is no smoke machine. There is no backdrop. There's very few props. But what happens is you show up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in an open-air theater, and you are asked to use your imagination to make up, and this is a quotation from Shakespeare, to make up for the imperfections of the actors. This is from Henry V. The chorus, before the play begins, says, okay, you know what? You're in London. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but you have to imagine that we're going to be transported to the vasty fields of France. You have to see, when I say that there is a horse's hoof stomping on the ground, you have to see it in your mind's eye. And that invitation for us to harness our imaginations in order to create something that does not exist without us showing up is, for me, a beautifully designed classroom. So I don't stand up there behind a podium anymore and show some PowerPoints and then expect my students to be passive consumers of knowledge that they will then regurgitate back to me. I started that way. I started as a junior faculty because that was what was modeled for me. But very soon into my career, I realized that everyone was falling asleep when I was talking about Shakespeare, and that hurt my heart. So I had to figure out how to move away from the podium and into circle and to create the same invitation that Shakespeare gives us. Emma Smith, a Shakespearean scholar, says that Shakespeare gives us air holes, gaps to breathe into, that a Shakespeare play cannot happen unless we show up, in the same way that a well-designed classroom cannot happen unless we invite all of our three-dimensional, beautiful, imperfect learners to sit and build something together that is beautiful, that is ephemeral, that is live, that is magical, that cannot be planned, but it can be designed for. And for me, a civil and just society has those same qualities. So in 1939, John Dewey wrote a very short speech called Creative Democracy, and he was terrified at what was happening in Europe. He saw the absolute rise of fascism, was absolutely alarmed, and said, if we treat democracy as something monolithic, as an institution that is somehow removed from us or somebody else's job, it already starts to deteriorate. It already disintegrates. We must imagine that every encounter, every conversation, every decision that we make is contributing to democracy. It is a creative democracy. So if we come back to those fundamental principles now, which I think are really timely and urgent, to sit and look at what that invitation might be for all of us, to sit around the tables, to foster belonging and mattering, right? That you belong in these conversations and your perspective matters. That's a well-designed classroom, but my goodness, that's a beautiful democracy. So how do we do that? How do we sit in, and we see it south of the border happening right now, where there is a systemic commitment to dehumanizing people, to stripping them of their human rights. We cannot be smug or arrogant in Canada. We have a moment where we sit in radical humanization. And I think we've got all of the tools we need. They're hiding in plain sight. They're hiding in our classrooms. They're hiding with our learners, who are our best guides and hope warriors. They're hiding in the conversations and disciplinary lenses that we bring to bear to this work. We have everything we need to build a creative future, and now is the time for us to lead.
Merci beaucoup. Paul, it's really, really highly interesting and visionary. Paul, how can we prepare students to transform their immediate environment and change the world?
We do that. Mais, il y a une chose que peut-être on peut faire, puis je vais ramener ça encore une fois à quelque chose de beaucoup plus immédiat, peut-être plus personnel. Jusqu'à maintenant, il y avait une seule femme que je trouvais formidable au-delà de tous les mots que je peux connaître, puis c'est mon épouse. Maintenant, il y en a une deuxième qui peut entrer dans cette catégorie. Puis mon épouse est aussi une professeure de littérature, et pas shakespearienne, mais plus antillaise. Et il y a une chose qu'elle réussit à faire, puis je l'ai vu faire, puis je pense que c'est quelque chose que les professeurs, le corps enseignant peut avoir, c'est de s'asseoir avec une jeune personne, puis lui parler, la voir, la reconnaître, la valider. Puis quand cette personne sort de notre bureau, parce qu'on l'a regardée, parce qu'on l'a vue, parce qu'on a approuvé ce qu'elle était, il faut que cette personne-là se sente capable de faire quoi que ce soit. À petite échelle puis à très court terme, ça va être réussir son cours de littérature. ou son cours de philosophie, ou son cours de n'importe quoi qu'elle va faire à l'université. Puis sur ce petit succès-là, c'est-à-dire avoir réussi son cours à l'université parce que quelqu'un lui a dit qu'elle était capable, puis quelqu'un lui a donné les moyens d'actualiser son potentiel, bien après ça, elle va se dire « Hey, je suis une personne qui est capable de faire quelque chose. » Puis elle va aller avec cette nouvelle attitude-là dans un autre cours. Puis après ça, elle va avoir son diplôme. Puis elle va avoir son diplôme parce qu'elle a été capable d'avoir son diplôme. Puis après ça, elle va s'en aller dans le monde en disant « Hey, j'ai un diplôme. Puis j'ai des connaissances, je suis une personne qui est capable de faire quelque chose. » Donc sur le plan, on est passé du très macro, on peut aller sur le très micro, puis c'est un privilège puis un pouvoir qu'on a comme professeur, puis il faut être extrêmement attentionné puis prudent avec ça. On a à la fois le pouvoir de détruire quelqu'un, détruire sa confiance en lui disant « tu es bon à rien », ou juste pas la reconnaître, pas la voir, pas acquiescer, pas valider sa présence, son identité, multiple, diverse. Puis on a le pouvoir de faire exactement le contraire, de prendre cette personne-là puis de la convaincre qu'elle est capable de changer le monde, même si Donald Trump, même si les changements climatiques, même si l'examen dans 2 semaines. Donc je pense que ça, c'est quelque chose que peut-être sur le plan très, très micro, très relationnel, on peut faire. Puis c'est le genre de choses que j'ai l'impression peut partir un effet papillon. Parce que si cette personne-là a confiance, elle va être capable de transmettre cette confiance-là à quelqu'un d'autre. Et ainsi de suite. Et c'est comme ça qu'on va réussir. Peut-être, en tout cas, on va mettre les chances de notre côté à pouvoir changer les choses.
I would like to ask you both how you envision pedagogy in the post-secondary sector ecosystem to best equip post-secondary students to meet the needs of the 21st century learners. We have this new generation now coming up with lots of, we've talked about challenges, but I think that these are the ones we can perceive. I think they'll face maybe bigger challenges.
Yes. What alarms me? So I'm a hope scholar. Written a bunch of books about hope because I wrote the books I needed to read. I despair all of the time. I howl into the abyss. I hide under the covers. I panic at the disco. I have group chats where I literally will just text, howl into the abyss. Right? Because this is really hard and this is overwhelming. And I am 47 and well-employed and very safe and very privileged. So our new generation, our emerging generation, who is precarious, contingent, looking at this world, inheriting these broken systems, experiencing eco-grief, heartbreak, horror, genocide, geopolitical instability, income inequality, all of these things, they're really howling into the abyss. And what disheartens me is that we have seen this 18 to 22-year-old demographic reporting the lowest rates of hope since we've started recording them. Oh my God, that is so disheartening. Because these are our hope warriors. This new generation coming up help us challenge the actual in the name of the possible. They help us surface systems that become invisible to us as we get closer to centers of power. They speak truth to power. They hold us to account. And if they are full of despair and disengagement, we are in big trouble. And so I want to pick up, I had a whole answer for that question, but I'm changing it up because I really want to pick up on this word that Paul keeps using of courage. What does it mean to have courage at this moment? And courage comes from the old French cœur, heart. The answer doesn't lie in our brains. The answer doesn't lie in tables where we're the smartest person in the room. The answer lies in our hearts and leading with our hearts right now. Bell Hooks wrote this beautiful book called All About Love, and the subtitle is The Pedagogy of Hope, right? And she says that we must center our hearts, our love. You don't hear the word love very often at a Board of Governors table or at Senate, right? We don't hear it in our conversations or our storytelling about higher education. All of us were called to this work because we love the work. We love the conversations, we love the content, but what we love is the content in community, in rumbling, in reflecting, in challenging us to think differently, more broadly, more expansively. And I think we need to put the heart back in education. We have dismembered ourselves to the point where we are depleted and dismembered. Parker Palmer wrote a book called The Courage to Teach that I read every May, because every May when the academic term ends, I get the blues. And I didn't notice this for a long time. My husband's like, oh yeah, this is your May Blue Week because you no longer have access to students. And I'm like, oh, is that a thing? But I do. I get really sad, and I get this sort of post-term hangover, and I go to my bed and I read Parker Palmer's Courage to Teach. And he says the reason why we are exhausted in the academy is we've dismembered ourselves. We're living too much up here and not enough in our bodies, our spirits, our hearts, and in connection to one another, that we must, he encourages us, live an undivided life to bring all of the things that we have in our world into the work. Being a first-generation student, a child of an immigrant, a messy human with 2 young children and a dog and a cat and a giant human, right? All of those things, if I bring them, giant husband, I have a giant, he's 6'8", he's giant. He's as noisy as he is big. But that is, I live a messy, imperfect, unfurling, 3-dimensional life, and if I dismember that when I walk into the classroom, or when I walk into Senate, or when I walk into my board meeting, and I dismember it and I leave it behind, I dismember myself. And I only work in one note, on one level. And Parker Palmer asks us if we're going to imagine what he calls a new professoriate, we need to remember after we have been dismembered. And I think that remembering lies in Bell Hook's work, All About Love. I think it lies in Paulo Freire's work, where he wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and 20 years later, he wrote The Pedagogy of Hope. He got more hopeful. We can get more hopeful, but only if we live in this undivided life where we center our heart and we have the courage to be able to do that work together.
Is pedagogy only a means through which content is taught or learned, or the very foundations of education? And I think what you point to is between content, which are rationality, what's in the head, and the heart. So pedagogy would be, if I understand, the combination of both, of the rationality or the knowledge, but also what belongs here. Sorry, I'm hitting my microphone. But in your view, where are post-secondary institutions heading with regard to pedagogy? That kind of pedagogy.
Colin, do you want to answer that first? Do you want me to howl into the abyss?
Ben, c'est pas naturel. C'est pas enseigner avec son cœur comme ça, enseigner. Je vais proposer une autre façon de le formuler. C'est enseigner en tant qu'humain à des humains. C'est humaniser. Vous disiez tantôt, on est dans un environnement où les pouvoirs en place font des gros efforts pour déshumaniser les concitoyens, pour déshumaniser la population, pour déshumaniser un paquet de choses. On n'en a pas parlé ici, on en a parlé dans d'autres conversations, mais l'intelligence artificielle aussi est quelque chose d'extraordinairement challengeant, je dirais, pour l'humanisation des relations. Donc, je pense que si on fait juste s'assumer en tant qu'être humain, puis s'assumer, un peu comme je le disais précédemment, qu'on parle à des êtres humains et les encourager à être des êtres humains, c'est-à-dire s'assumer dans leurs émotions, valider, recevoir ces émotions-là, assumer, valider aussi que le monde dans lequel on vit va générer, pour peu qu'on soit justement humain, des émotions qui vont être contradictoires, des émotions qui vont aller du désespoir, qui vont aller de la peur, de l'anxiété, parce que c'est très, très démonisé aussi, hein, ces émotions-là. On n'a pas le droit d'être anxieux. On n'a pas le droit d'avoir peur, même si tout est en place pour avoir vraiment peur. Quelqu'un qui n'a pas peur aujourd'hui, là, il est bizarre. C'est quelqu'un qui ne comprend pas trop qu'est-ce qui se passe. Ceci dit, la peur, ça fait partie de la vie. Le monde est épeurant. Sortir de chez soi quand on est un enfant, c'est épeurant. Aller dans l'eau du lac Ontario, c'est épeurant. Aller sur un bateau, c'est épeurant. Aller dans un avion, c'est épeurant. Aller à l'école, c'est épeurant. Ceci dit, il faut faire avec. Puis une fois qu'on a compris que cette peur-là, on est capable de la surmonter, que cette peur-là, on peut l'utiliser comme un carburant, on peut aller plus loin. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui est possible de faire à l'école et en classe aussi, pour peu qu'on acquiesce, qu'on valide, qu'on reconnaisse que les gens avec qui on est, que nous-mêmes, en fait, on est des êtres humains, tout simplement. Donc, ça peut vouloir dire de faire une place plus grande au cœur. Sauf que, c'est drôle, mon cours portait là-dessus la semaine dernière, mais de formuler la chose comme ça, en tout respect, évidemment, c'est de mettre une opposition entre la tête et le cœur, alors qu'il n'y a pas d'opposition à avoir là, nécessairement. C'est simplement quelque chose qui vient ensemble. Si on met l'accent sur un, c'est parce qu'on oublie l'autre. Il n'y a pas d'opposition, les deux vont ensemble. Puis à partir du moment où on questionne ces oppositions-là, bien, on questionne le principe même d'opposition. Puis c'est là qu'on peut commencer à dire yes and plutôt que no but, n'est-ce pas?
Yes, yeah. I love that. And I think that, so as soon as I finished writing Hope Circuits 1.0, I started writing 2.0 because I recognize that the conversations have to unfurl and build, and that we can only metabolize this moment together in conversation and build mindsets necessary for social movement building. And so when I wrote Hope Circuits, generative AI hadn't come out. In fact, ChatGPT showed up in January, and I had sent the proofs for the book in December, right before the winter break. And so all of a sudden, one of the things that has disrupted our pedagogy or changed it or challenged it, I hadn't thought about, rumbled with, because it was so new and it was so, we couldn't even come up with policies necessary to account for the technological disruptions that were happening in real time. And so I started to think about, Paul, you were saying, what does it mean to be a human? Right? And so I have a chapter called How to Human in the rise of AI, right? And how do we look at AI, which is built to create frictionless worlds, to create a frictionless or seamless user experience where everything that we can imagine is at our fingertips, that it is easily available and accessible. It can wayfind in all sorts of ways. It is going to, I think, transform academic advising, mentoring, therapy. I have a friend who's doing therapy with ChatGPT. She told me about that on the walk to school the other day, and I thought, okay, what does this mean right now to the ways in which we are learning and teaching? And so I make the argument that education, if AI is creating a frictionless user experience, education's role is to add the friction, add the difficulty, add the discomfort, because we know from transformative learning that discomfort is the feature, not the flaw of learning, that anytime that you are transforming, you are uncomfortable and you are stretched outside of your status quo and your normal way of understanding the world. We know that from Maren Land, who talks about threshold concepts, that you cross an interstitial space with great discomfort, and you're not just changing your epistemological orientation, but you're changing ontologically. You're changing in your very identities. So what does it mean for us in the rise of AI and technological disruptions in pedagogy to put the friction back, to put the questions back, to put the discomfort, to frame it so it's safe and brave for people to transform together and in community? And so what I think we have an invitation to do is ask how to human. And I'm a literature professor, I am violating some grammatical rules there when I say how to human as a verb. What does it mean to be human? One of the things that we have as humans that robots don't is a sense of the future. ChatGPT is an accumulation of all already known knowledge that is already written and available, that is curated really quickly and speedily. But it doesn't imagine the future in the weirdness, in the strange configurations, in the oddity. We're so odd. We're so weird as humans. We are inefficient. We are frustrating in our aspirations and our audacity. That's what makes us human. How do we center our educational systems around deliberate inefficiencies, friction, discomfort, joy, grief, despair, fear, life? And I think that we have an invitation to build those systems and that pedagogy around how to human.
Well, I think that gives a very nice view of the future of pedagogy. Thank you so much. I think our time is coming to an end, but I really enjoyed your thoughts, both of you. I think we've been very fortunate to have literary specialist and a philosopher talk about the pedagogies of togetherness and thinking of it in a way that really is really essential to the human activity of teaching and learning and evolving and transforming, and in the conditions in which we are now and the timely aspect of that that we need to address how we think of future learning and pedagogy as we move forward. So thank you so much, both of you. Thank you to all for attending as well.
Effectivement, merci beaucoup. La pédagogie comme une belle histoire d'amour. Pourquoi pas? Merci donc à nos panélistes Paul Turcotte, Jessica Riddell, notre modérateur Normand Labrie. On behalf of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences and George Brown College, thank you to the Big Thinking Lecture Series sponsors, University of Canada, and today's session sponsor, Canadian Foundation for Innovation. I do want to remind you and your friends that they didn't catch this, that the video recording will be on the virtual platform in the coming days. I also want to mention that there is a table with a book for those who are now interested in buying and reading Hope Circuit just around the corner. Et je vous souhaite à tous et à toutes une très belle après-midi avec beaucoup d'autres sessions d'inspiration, d'espoir jusqu'à la fin du congrès qui se terminera vendredi. Mais profitez bien de cet après-midi et de la journée de demain avant qu'on se quitte vendredi. Merci.